Hey guys, Mr. G here. In this video, we're going to take a look at graphing transformations, and we're going to take a look at two kinds of transformations for a tangent function. We're going to take a look at a phase shift, which is known as the horizontal shift, or the vertical shift. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the first example, where we have y equals to tan of x minus 45. Now, if we take a look at what kind of transformation that 45 is going to represent, we see that 45 is in the same spot as C, all right? And then C is associated with the phase shift, meaning the horizontal shift, all right? So that means that the 45 is going to be related to the phase shift. But before I figure out what is a phase shift, let's go ahead and figure out the period of the graph and the quarters. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and figure out the period. So I'm gonna do it over here. All right, so we have the period. So for the period, you take 180 degrees and divide it by the value for B, which in this case is gonna be 1, since there is no number in front of X. So I have 180 divided by 1, I still get 180. So now we can go ahead and figure out the quarters. And with the quarters, we take whatever the period is and divide it by 4. All right. So I have 180 divided by 4, and I end up with 45 degrees. So to go from one X value to the next, I'm going by 45. All right. And then we have one more, which is going to be now the phase shift. So for the phase shift, if we take a look at that, we see that I take my value for C, which is in this case is 45. All right, so I'm going to take 45 and divide it by B, which is going to be 1. All right, so we have 45 divided by 1, and I still end up with 45 degrees. Okay, so for the phase shift, it follows the same rule as a horizontal shift. And if you guys recall with the rules for the horizontal shift, we always follow the opposite side that we're given. So we have a minus, and the opposite of a minus is plus. So that means that for the phase shift, I'm going to be moving 45 units to the right. All right, so I got my period, I got the period of the graph, the quarters, and the phase shift. So we're gonna use all that information to graph this function. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm gonna make my graph. And we're gonna be using the original graph for a tangent of X to try to get my new graph. Now, if we recall the previous video, we always start at the origin, which is 0, 0. However, we actually do have a phase shift going on, which is 45 units to the right. So instead of starting at 0, 0, I'm actually going to start at 45. So somewhere right here. Yeah, I'm going to do it. Let me see. I'm actually going to do it right here. So we start at 45, 0. So that's going to be my midpoint. That's going to be the middle point of the graph for tangent. All right. So if you guys recall, for each tangent graph, we have two vertical asymptotes. So we got to figure out what are the two vertical asymptotes. All right. So we know that the period is 180 degrees. All right. And with the period, it will help us figure out, well, what are the two degrees that have the asymptote that are in the middle of the graph, or it was in between the graph. All right. So what I can do is I can take 180 and split that into half, since 45 is the middle number of the graph. All right, so if I take a half of 180, I get 90. So that means that from the midpoint to one asymptote, that's going to be 90 degrees from 45, and then the other asymptote on the left side is going to be 90 degrees to the left. All right, so we're going to go ahead and figure out the asymptotes in between 45. So let me go ahead and get my calculator or calculator. All right, so if I were to take 45 and add it to 90, I get 135 as one of the asymptotes. So 135. All right, so now if we try to figure out the vertical asymptote of the left side of the midpoint, I'm gonna take 45 and subtract it to 90, and I get negative 45 degrees. So my other asymptote is gonna be negative 45 degrees, so I'm going to do it somewhere right here. All right, so we have 45 degrees, negative to be exact. All right, and so now I have my, all right, so then I have my two halves that are in between this midpoint. So I have this over here. Now, if we recall, the quarters are 45. All right, so let's go ahead and get these graphs. So starting over here, we have the middle. And over here, let me see. It might be on the x-axis or away from it, but we'll figure it out. Now, we know that to get from one x value to the next, we go by 45. So let's say if I were to figure out, well, what's the missing value over here? So if we were to take a look, what I can do is I can take 45 and then add it to 45. I end up with 90. And then if I were to figure out the other half that's on the left side of 45, I could take 45 and subtract it to the quarter, which is 45, and I end up with 0. All right, so that means that my other half of the midpoint is actually on the x-axis. So let's go ahead and get my graph. Now I'm not gonna use an x and y table. What I could actually do is use the pattern that we have for the graph of tangent. So with the two halves that we have over here, we're going to be using the pattern which starts off at low, mid, then high. Low, mid, then high. So let me label my y-axis, so -1 and +1. All right, if you guys can see that, let me make this bold. All right, so starting off at 0, I'm at low point, 45 is already on the mid, and then 90 is at the high point. And then I connect my points, and I'm gonna use a fuchsia looking pen, maybe pink, I don't know. And then we're gonna connect the points and make our graph for the first one. Okay, so now what we can do is get our other, all right, we're gonna get the second tangent graph by, all right, to figure out the other asymptote in between, that's in between 135, that's in the range of 135 and another value. So to figure that out, I'm gonna take 135 up here, and then I'm gonna add it to my period, which is 180, and that gives me 315. So all right, so we have our second graph from 135 to 315. So I'm going to put it over here. Oh, my pen ran out. Let me use another black one. 315. All right. So now I'm going to get my midpoint. All right, and then my two halves. And now we know that each x value is going by 45. So if I were to take 135 and add it to 45, I get 180. So I'm gonna put it up here. And then I have 180 plus another 45. That's gonna give me 225. And then I can take 225 and then add it to 45, I get 270. And then if I add this to 45, it should be 315. All right, so then I'm gonna use a pattern for low, mid, then high. Connect the points. All right, and there we have it. So now we're gonna get our third and final graph with the little space that we have over here. So now we have the third graph that is in the range of 315 and another asymptote. So I'm gonna take 315 and add it to 180, which is the period, and I get 495. All right, so I have my other asymptote, it's gonna be 495. All right, so then I have my midpoint. Now, what I could do instead of constantly adding by 45, which could help by the way, to figure out the number of the middle number, what I can do is I can take the period, which is 180, and divide it by half, take half, which I get 90. And then if I were to do 315 plus 90, I get 405. So that means that my middle number is 405. There's a few ways to get the X values, whichever works as long as we get the correct values. All right? And then I have my two halves in between the midpoint. All right, so starting off with 315, I'm gonna take 315 and add it to 45. That gives me 360. All right, and then if 360 plus 45 gives me 405. And then 405 plus 45, that should give me 450. And then if I add this to 45, I should get 495. And then I'm gonna use a pattern for the graph. So I have low at 360, mid at 405, and high at 450. Go ahead, connect the points, make the graph, and there we have it. So we have our graph for tan of x minus 45. And if we were to compare this to the original graph, we see that the graph shifted to the right. Not that much, but it did shift a bit, because if we take a look at the two midpoints, we see that this one started at 0, 0, and then this starts at 45, 0. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the second example. So the second example is not that bad. All we have is tan of x plus 2. So if I were to match the 2 with the letter of the format, we see that 2 is in the same spot as D. There's no parentheses. There's no parentheses over here, and there's no number that represents C. All right, so D is associated with the vertical shift. So whatever number is D is going to represent the vertical shift, and we follow the same sign. So since this 2 is a positive, that means I'm going to move 2 units up. All right. Now before we do that, I want to figure out what is the period and the quarters for this graph. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out the period. I'm going to do it up here. So the period, you take 180 divided by the number for B, which in this case is 1, and I still get 180. All right, so then if for the quarters, all right, for the quarters, if you take 180 and divide it by 4, you should end up with 45. So that means to get from one X value to the next, we go by 45. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and make my graph. Oh, let me write the vertical shift. So we have the vertical shift. So I'm gonna write vertical shift. So for the vertical shift, we just go 2 units up. So that means that all of the 3 points, we're gonna move 2 units up. So for the midpoints, instead of being at 0, we're actually gonna be at 2. And then for 1, the highest point, instead of being at 1, we're actually gonna be at 3. And then for -1, instead of being at -1, we're gonna be at 1. All right, so let's go ahead and make my new graph. All right, so I'm gonna do it over here. And then I'm going to lower the x-axis since majority of the graph is gonna happen above it. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, So let's go ahead and make my graph. So we start at 0, 0. There is no vertical shift, so we're still at 0, 0. Oh. However, if we recall, we actually have a vertical shift. So originally I would start at 0, 0, but because we have a vertical shift, I'm actually gonna start at 0, 2, all right? So all of my midpoints are gonna be at 2, all of my high points are gonna be at 3, and all of my low points are gonna be at 1, all right? So let's go ahead and make the two asymptotes. So there is no phase shift, no horizontal shift. So my x values from the original graph are gonna be the same for this graph, all right? So if we take a look, I have my two asymptotes, which are negative 90 and positive 90. So negative 90 over here and positive 90 over here. And then we have 0, all right? And then we have the two 45s, one on the right and one on the left. And then we're gonna use the pattern. So we have, starting at negative 45, is gonna start off as the low point. And then 2 is the midpoint. And then at 45, our highest point is 3. And then I connect the points. All right, and then up here. Okay, so we see that the graph from the original one shifted 2 units up for the new graph. So we're gonna continue with that. We're gonna continue to make our tangent graphs. So we have our other two. All right, so we have two asymptotes from 90 to 270. So I'm gonna make my other asymptote. So we have 270. And then we have our midpoint, which is 180. And then our two halves for the middle point, which are gonna be 135 and 225. All right, so now I'm gonna plot my points, starting with 180, which is the midpoint. Now remember, all of the midpoints are at 2 for my y value. Then my 135 is low. And then 225 is the highest. Connect the points. There we have our graph. All right, so now we're gonna keep going with our last one. So we're going from 270 to 450. So we have 270, and then I'm gonna put 450 over here. All right. So then I have my middle number in between the two asymptotes, which is 360. All right, so 360. Then we have our two halves in between the middle, 315, 405. Okay. And then 360 is the middle, so I'm gonna use, so 360, the midpoint is on 2. For 315, that's the low point, so it's gonna be on 1. And then we have 405, which is the highest. And then connect the points. And then we have our 3 graphs. So all I did was, I just moved each point from the graph 2 units up, right? And remember, with tangent graphs, there is no maximum, no minimum, and no amplitude. So that's why instead of the pattern being having anything to do with max or min, we're actually referring to it as low and high. All right, so let's take a look at 2 more examples. So for the third example, I have y equals the tan of x plus 225, all right? So if we take a look, the 225 is in the same spot as C, so that's gonna represent some sort of phase shift. So before that, let's go ahead and figure out the period. So the period, I take 180 and divide it by my number for B, which in this case is 1. And I still get 180. And then figure out the quarters. I take 180 divided by 4. I end up with 45 units. Then we have the phase shift. The phase shift. So with that, you take the value for C, which is 225. But if we take a look, we went from a negative value to a positive 225. So if we think about it, this 225 has to be a negative. So it's negative 225 divided by 1. I still end up with negative 225. And since my phase shift is a negative, that means I'm going to be shifted to the left side. So that means we're going to move 225 units to the left. So let's go ahead and graph my points. So if it's going to be shifted by that much to the left, it seems like majority of the graph is going to be on the left side of the x-axis. So let's go ahead and make my graph. So I'm gonna move this over here. So I'm gonna move the y-axis further to the left. Further to the right, so that way I have more space on the left. Okay, so originally we would start at 0, 0, but since my phase shift is 225 units to the left, that means that my starting point is going to be 225 units. So I'm going to make it all the way over here. And that's going to be a negative. So this is going to be my middle point. All right. So now I got to figure out, well, what are the asymptotes that are in the range and where negative 225 is in the middle. All right. So to figure that out, we know that the period in between the two asymptotes is 180. And since this is the middle, what I can do is I can take half of 180 to figure out my two numbers for the asymptotes. So if I take half of 180 is 90. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take negative 225 and add that to 90. And that's going to give me negative 135. So I have negative 135 over here. All right. And then for my left side of negative 225, I'm going to take negative 225 and subtract it to 90. And I end up with negative 315. All right. So I have my first graph starting good. So then I have my two halves in between negative 225. So now to figure that out, we know that the quarters is 45. So to get from one x value to the next, I'm going by 45. So I'm taking negative 315 added to 45. I get negative 270. All right. Then if I were to add negative 270 to 45, I get negative 225. And then we have negative 225 plus 45. I get negative 180. That seems a little too small. Let me write it up here. Better. All right. So I have my values on the x-axis for the first part of the graph. So now I'm going to use the pattern to get my graph. So after this first asymptote, my first x value is going to be the lowest point. So we have 270 comma negative 1, so 0.51. Then 225 is the mid. Then 180 is going to be the high. Connect my points. There's my first graph. All right, moving on. So let me label the y-axis. All right, so moving on. Now we got to get our second graph. So I have my asymptote in between negative 135 and another kind of asymptote. So what I can do is I can take negative 135 and add it to 180. And that's going to give me 45 degrees. So that means from 135 to 140, that's going to be my other graph. So I'm going to put it over here. And then I have my middle point. So to figure that out, what I can do is take I can take negative 135 and add it to 90 since that is half of 180. So negative 135 plus 90, that's going to give me negative 45. So that means that my middle point is going to be at around negative 45, so somewhere over here. All right. So then I have my two halves in between negative 45, which is the middle point. All right. So to figure out the two halves, I'm going to take negative 135 and now add it to the quarter, which is 45. And that gives me negative 90. All right, and then we go from negative 90 to negative 45. And then if I were to take negative 45 and add it to 45, I get 0. So that means that my other half is on the x-axis. All right, so let's go ahead and make my graph for the second half, for the second graph. So starting at negative 90, that's going to be my low point. At negative 45, that's my mid. And then at 0, that's my high. All right. So connect the points, make the graph. And there we have the second graph. So now we just need one more graph. So start off at 45, and then I'm going to take 180, and I get positive 225. So we have the third graph that's in between 45 and 225. All right. So now we have our third graph, and then to figure out the middle point, I can take 45 and add it to 90, and that's going to give me 135. All right. And that's going to be the midpoint. And then I have the two halves in between 135. So now each x value is going by 45. So if I add 45 to 45, I should get 90. Then if I add 90 to 45, I get 135. And then 135 plus 45, that should give me 180. All right. So now I'm going to follow the pattern. So after the asymptote for 45, 90 is low, 135 is mid, and 180 is high. Connect the points. There we have it. All right. So if you take a look from the original graph to the new graph, you see that we see that the graph definitely shifted to the left by a lot. All right. So far, so good. Just have one more problem to look at. So for this one, we have 3 times tan of 2x plus 90. So with that one, I need to find all my information. Because you see that we have 3 that's in the same spot as A, which affects the y values. Then we have 2 for B, and then we have plus 90 for C. All right. So first off, let's figure out the period of this graph. So with the period, I'm going to take 180 and divide it by my value for B, which is 2. And then I end up with 90 degrees for my for the period. All right, so instead of the two asymptotes being 180 degrees, the period in between two asymptotes is going to be now 90. And then I'm going to figure out the quarters. So for the quarters, I have 90 divided by 4, and if I were to divide those two numbers, 90 divided by 4, that should give me 22.5. So to get from one x value to the next, I'm going by 22.5. So far so good. Now, if we take a look at the 90, we see that 90 is in the same spot as C, and C is associated with the phase shift. So we have a phase shift. Let's figure out what that phase shift is. All right, so for the phase shift, I have my C, which is a 90, but this 90 is going to be a negative, divided by B, which is 2. And that's going to give me negative 45. So that means my phase shift is going to is negative 45 units. And with the phase shift, that's going to be, the negative direction is the left side. So that's going to be 45 units to the left. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and make my graph. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it over here. And I'm gonna put it in the middle. And remember, we still have the 3 in the middle. And the 3 is gonna affect the y values. So we're going to triple this 1, and it's gonna be a 3 now. So now my highest point is gonna be at 3. And then my lowest point is gonna be at -3. So in reality, we're just multiplying the y values. All right, let's go ahead and make my graph. So I have my midpoints at 0, 0. However, we do have the phase shift, which is at -45. So I'm gonna start off on the left side of the graph, which is -45, so somewhere right here. So 45, negative, that is the midpoint. All right, so now I have 2 asymptotes in between -45. Now, we recall that the period is 90. Now, to figure out the 2 asymptotes, the -45 is in the middle of the 2 asymptotes. So since this is in the middle, I can take half of 90 to figure out the 2 numbers that -45 is in between it. All right. So if I take half of 90, I get 45. So what I can do to get the right side of this point is take -45 and add it to 45, and I get 0. So my 1 asymptote is going to be on the y-axis. And then we have the left side of -45. So if I were to subtract those two numbers, I should get -90. So I'm going to put it, so 90, negative, asymptote. There we go. And then I have the 2 halves. All right, now with the 2 halves, the quarter is 22.5. So to go from one x value to the next, we just add 22.5. So starting off with -90, if I take -90 and add it to 22.5, I get -67.5. All right, that's gonna be the low point, then -45 is my midpoint, and then I take -45 and add it to 22.5, I get -22.5, and that's gonna be the high point. All right, so I'm gonna make my graph. Starting after the first asymptote, we have low point at -3. Remember, the 3 is affected. The three in the front affects the y values. Then we have -45, which is still on 0, because anything times 0 is still 0. And then -22.5, it goes up to 3. Connect the points. Perfect. All right, so now I have my next second graph, which is in between 0 and another asymptote. So if I were to take 0 and add it to the period, which is 90, I'm gonna get 90 as my second asymptote. All right, and then we have the middle point, which is gonna be 45, because half of 90 is 45, and if I add 0 to 45, I get 45. And then I have the 2 halves. All right, so to figure out the numbers representing these 2 axes, I'm gonna go ahead and add each x value to 22.5. So 0 plus 22.5 is 22.5. And then we go from there to 45, then 45 added to 22.5. That should give me 67.5. So I'm gonna write it up here. Okay, so now I'm going to make my graph. So at 22.5, that's the low point at -3. 45, that's the mid. 67, that's the high. There we have the graph. Now we're moving to one more graph. All right, so we're going from 90 to my other asymptote. So I add that to 90 degrees, I get 180. All right, so my 2 asymptotes are from 90 to 180. Okay, so now we need to figure out the middle number. So I take 90 and add it to half of 90, which is 45. I should get 135 degrees. All right, and then I have the two halves. And to figure out those numbers, I'm gonna take each x value and add it to 22.5. So if I take 90 and add it to 22.5, I get 112.5. Then if I add that, then from here we go to 135. And then if I add 135 to 22.5, that's gonna give me 157.5. All right, so far so good. And then we stop at that. I stop at the asymptote. So now we're gonna make the graph. So after the asymptote at 90 degrees, I'm at the low point. Then 135 is the mid, which I should have drawn earlier. And then 157 is the high point, which is at 3. Connect my points, and there we have it. So those are the examples of the phase shift and the vertical shift of the tangent graphs. All right. If you guys still have any other questions, feel free to email me. Hope you guys have a wonderful day.